morning, friends. All right, so we are going to start chapter 5. So the elevator had just linked up with that hotel, and we just heard the president, who is not very smart, he's kind of ridiculous, talking about that he thought that it was some dangerous group of people trying to attack their space hotel. Now, remember, it's not really. The president just isn't a very aware person, and he doesn't want to listen to anybody who knows anything. So instead, he's just making guesses. And even the astronauts who are trying to tell him what's real, he's not listening to them. So he's coming up with his own ideas, and they're not very true, and they're not very accurate. So let's see what's happening with Charlie right now. Chapter 5, Men from Mars. There's no floating inside the space hotel. The gravity-making machine had seen to that. So once the docking had been triumphantly achieved, Mr. Wonka, Charlie, Grandpa Joe, and Mr. and Mrs. Bucket were able to walk into the great glass elevator into the lobby of the hotel. As for Grandpa George, Grandma Georgina, and Grandma Josephine, none of them had had their feet on the ground for over 20 years, and they certainly weren't going to change their habits now. So when the floating stopped, they all three plopped right back into bed again and insisted that the bed with them in it be pushed into the space hotel. Charlie gazed around the huge lobby. On the floor there was a thick green carpet. 20 tremendous chandeliers hung shimmering from the ceiling. The walls were covered with valuable pictures, and there were big soft armchairs all over the place. At the far end of the room there were 5 elevator doors. The group stared in silence at all this luxury. No one dared to speak. Mr. Wonka had warned them that every word they uttered would be picked up by Space Control in Houston, so they had better be careful. A faint humming noise came from somewhere below the floor, but that only made the silence even more spooky. Charlie took hold of Grandpa Joe's hand and held it very tight. He wasn't sure he liked this very much. They had broken into the greatest machine ever built by man, the property of the United States government, and if they were discovered and captured, as they surely would be in the end, what would happen to them then? Jail for life? Yes, or something much worse. Mr. Wonka was writing on a little pad. He held up the pad, and it said, "Anybody hungry?" The 3 old ones in the bed began waving their arms and nodding and opening and shutting their mouths. Mr. Wonka turned the paper over. On the other side it said, "The kitchens of this hotel are loaded with luscious food, lobsters, steaks, ice cream. We shall have a feast to end all feasts." Suddenly a tremendous booming voice came out of a loudspeaker hidden somewhere in the room. "Attention!" boomed the voice, and Charlie jumped. So did Grandpa Joe. Everybody jumped, even Mr. Wonka. "Attention, the 8 foreign astronauts. This is Space Control in Houston, Texas, USA. You are trespassing on American property. You are ordered to identify yourselves immediately. Speak now." "Shh," whispered Wonka, his finger to his lips. There followed a few seconds of awful silence. Nobody moved except Mr. Wonka, who kept saying, "Shh, shh." "Who are you?" boomed the voice from Houston, and the whole world heard it. "I repeat, who are you?" shouted the urgent, angry voice. And 500 million people crouched in front of their television sets, waiting for an answer to come from the mysterious strangers inside the space hotel. The television was not able to show a picture of those mysterious strangers, for there is no camera in there to record the scene. Only the words came through. The TV watchers saw nothing but the outside of the giant hotel in orbit, photographed, of course, by Shuckworth, Shanks, and Showler, who were following closely behind. For half a minute the world waited for a reply. But no reply came. "Speak!" boomed the voice, getting louder and louder, and ending in fearfully frightening shouting that rattled Charlie's eardrums. "Speak, speak, speak!" Grandma Georgina shot under the sheet. Grandma Josephine stuck her fingers in her ears. Grandpa George buried his head in the pillow. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket, both petrified, were once again in each other's arms. Charlie was clutching Grandpa Joe's hand, and the 2 of them were staring at Mr. Wonka and begging him with their eyes to do something. Mr. Wonka stood very still, and although his face looked calm, you can be quite sure his clever, inventive brain was spinning like a dynamo. "This is your last chance," boomed the voice. "We are asking you once more, who are you? Reply immediately. If you do not reply, we shall be forced to regard you as dangerous enemies. We shall then press the emergency freezer switch, and the temperature in the space hotel will drop to minus 100 degrees centigrade. All of you will be instantly deep frozen. You have 15 seconds to speak. After that, you will turn into icicles. 1, 2, 3... "Grandpa," whispered Charlie as the counting continued, "we must do something. We must. Quick." 6, said the voice. 7, 8, 9... Mr. Wonka had not moved. He was still gazing straight ahead, still quite cool, perfectly expressionless. Charlie and Grandpa Joe were staring at him in horror. Then all at once they saw the tiny twinkling wrinkles of a smile appear around the corners of his eyes. He sprang to life. He spun round on his toes, skipped a few paces across the floor, and then, in a frenzied, unearthly sort of scream, he cried, "Fimbo Feezy!" The loudspeaker stopped counting. There was silence. All over the world, there was silence. Charlie's eyes were riveted on Mr. Wonka. He was going to speak again. He was taking a deep breath. "Bungo Bunny!" he screamed. He put so much force into his voice that the effort lifted him right up to the tips of his toes. See? He's screaming as loud as he can at Houston. "Bungo Bunny! Daffoo Dunny! You be lunny!" Again, the silence. The next time Mr. Wonka spoke, the words came out so fast and sharp and loud they were like bullets from a gun. "Zunk, zunk, 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 zunk," he barked. The noise echoed around and around the lobby of the Space Hotel. It echoed around the world. Mr. Wonka now turned and faced the far end of the lobby where the loudspeaker voice had come from. He walked a few paces forward as a man would, perhaps, who wanted a more intimate conversation with his audience. And this time, the tone was much quieter. The words came more slowly, but there was a touch of steel in every syllable. Now you guys are going to have to bear with me, because this is a very silly part Mr. Wonka does. "Kirasuku, Malabuku, Weeby, Wheezy, Unyubi, Cuckoo, Alipenda, Kakamenda, Pants for Lund, Info Suspenda, Funikika, Kandarika, we be stronger, you be weaker, Papakata, Boromoka, very risky, you provoker, Kati Kati, Moons and Stars, Ish, Venus, Mars." Did you recognize some of the words in there? Mr. Wonka paused dramatically for a few seconds. Then he took an enormous deep breath, and in a wild and fearsome voice he yelled out, "Kitty-me boo zook, zunk, Fimbleezy zook, Gugumiza zunk, Fumikaka zunk, Anapalala zunk zunk zunk." The effect of all this on the world below was electric. In the control room in Houston, in the White House in Washington, in palaces and city buildings, in mountains and shacks from America to China to Peru, the 500 million people who heard that wild and fearsome voice yelling out those strange and mystic words all shivered with fear before their television sets. Everybody began turning to everybody else and saying, "Who are they? What language was that? Where did they come from?" And the president study in the White House, Vice President Tibbs, the members of the cabinet, the chiefs of the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force, the Sword Swallower from Afghanistan, the chief financial advisor, and Mrs. Topsy-Puss the cat, all stood tense and rigid. They were more than a little afraid. But the president himself kept a cool head and a clear brain. "Nanny," he cried. "Oh, Nanny, what on earth do we do now?" "I'll get you a nice glass of warm milk," said Mrs. Tibbs. "I hate this stuff," said the president. "Please don't make me drink it." "Then summon the chief interpreter," said Miss Tibbs. "Summon the chief interpreter," said the president. "Where is he?" "Right here, Mr. President," said the chief interpreter. "What language was that creature speaking out there in the Space Hotel? Be quick! What was it?" "It wasn't anything I know, Mr. President." "Ha! Then was it Tagalong? Tagalong or Ergo?" "Not Tagalong, Mr. President. Not Ergo either. Was it Tulu then, or Tungus or Tupi?" "Definitely not Tulu, Mr. President, and I'm quite sure it wasn't Tungus or Tupi." "Don't stand there telling him what it wasn't," said Mrs. Tibbs. "Tell him what it was." "Yes, ma'am, Vice President, ma'am," said the chief interpreter, beginning to shake. "Believe me, Mr. President," he went on, "it was not a language I have ever heard before." See, there's the president, who is not very smart and needs his vice president, who is probably rather smart and bosses him around. And there's the chief interpreter with his giant old tome of books, of languages, and he doesn't know. "But I thought you knew every language in the world." "I do, Mr. President." "Don't lie to me, chief interpreter. How can you possibly know every language in the world when you don't know this one?" "It is not a language of this world, Mr. President." "Nonsense, man," barked Mrs. Tibbs. "I understood some of it myself." "These people, Miss Vice President, ma'am, have obviously just tried to learn a few of our easier words, but the rest of it is a language that had never before been heard on this earth." "Screaming scorpions!" cried the president. "You mean to tell me that they could be coming from somewhere else?" "Precisely, Mr. President." "Like where?" said the president. "Who knows?" said the chief interpreter. "But did you not notice, Mr. President, how they used the words Venus and Mars?" "Of course I noticed it," said the president. "But what's that got to do with it?" "Aha! I see what you're driving at. Good gracious from me! Men from Mars! And Venus, said the chief interpreter. That, said the president, could make for trouble. I'll say it could, said the chief interpreter. He wasn't talking to you, said Miss Tibbs. What do we do now, General, said the president. Cried the general. Can you think of something else, said the president crossly. I like blowing things up, said the general. It makes a lovely noise. Woomph, woomph. Don't be a fool, said Miss Tibbs. If you hurt those people, Mars will declare war on us, and so will Venus. Quite right, Nanny, said the president. We'd be troculated like turkeys, every one of us. We'd be mashed like potatoes. I'll take 'em on, shouted the chief of the army. Oh, be quiet, said Miss Tibbs. You're fired. Hooray, said all the other generals. Well done, Miss Vice President, ma'am. Mrs. Tibbs said, we've got to treat these fellows gently and politely. We've got to be polite to them. The one who spoke just now sounded extremely cross. We've got to be polite to them, butter them up, and make them happy. The last thing we want is to be invaded by men from Mars. We've got to talk to them, Mr. President. Tell Houston we want another direct radio link with the space hotel. And hurry. And that is the end of Chapter 5, my friends. So we just found out that Mr. Wonka made up an entirely random language of his own. I think he was just saying babbly words and making some English in the middle of it. And the president now thinks that Mr. Wonka and all of Charlie's family are space aliens. What do you think they're going to do? If they're all space aliens? The vice president, she thinks that they should be helpful and supportive. But the president is not a very smart cookie. Let's see what they do. All right, my friends, good night.